Good afternoon, everybody, and a particular welcome to those of you who are joining us online today. Today's event is part of the Development Matters series, which is kindly supported by Irish Aid. My name is Anya Hearns, and I will be your chair for today's event. A little bit about myself. I'm a retired Irish ambassador who spent a lot of my career working in the development field. I served as head of mission in Kampala, Uganda, and I was also ambassador to Malawi. So I have a keen interest in today's topic as well. We're delighted to be joined here today by our guest of honor, President Alvaro Lario, who is president of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, known as IFAD. President Lario will deliver a keynote address, which is entitled "From the Middle East Crisis to the Next Food Shock: Fertiliser, Energy and Global Food Security." Following President Lario's address, we will go to a Q&A session. And I would like to remind everybody, both online and here, that today's presentation and Q&A are both on the record. But first, before we go to our keynote speaker, I would like to welcome Ruth Parkin from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and invite Ruth to deliver some introductory remarks on behalf of Irish Aid, who, as I've mentioned, are the key supporter of the IAEA and the Development Matters series. Ruth is currently the Director of EU Multilateral Unit within Irish Aid and is a former Irish Ambassador to Finland. Ruth, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Anya. It's lovely to see former colleagues here today. It's lovely to welcome President Lario to Dublin. President Lario has already had a very productive couple of days. Some of you may have heard him on open engagements and with meetings with ministers and with President Connolly. He's had an opportunity to discuss these deeply topical issues with the government at a very timely moment, just a couple of weeks before we take on the presidency of the Council of the EU. The International Fund for Agricultural Development is one of the world's largest investors in agriculture, and in particular in smallholder farmers. There's an ongoing portfolio of 23 billion reaching out to 100 million of the world's poorest and most marginalized rural people to increase their productivity and incomes, access markets, find employment, and build resilience to shocks. IFAD plays a crucial role within the UN system, driving investment in agriculture, particularly focusing on that smallholder farmer cohort who make up over 70% of the world's poor population and who produce over 2/3 of the world's poor food. And in this context and at this time, I think it's really important that this lecture is looking at the situation in the Middle East and what's going to happen over the next period. We're beginning to hear conversations about fertiliser and shocks and what will happen. Inevitably, within the European Union, we're thinking about that for the consequences on the Union, but there will be massive consequences externally. And I think the message that we've heard over the last 2 days, and we'll hear more on now, is that shocks hit those smallholder farmers first. They hit hard, and there will be a requirement to respond given how the last few years have already played out and what we might expect from this year's weather, as well as from geopolitical events and their impacts. From Ireland's perspective, we have long championed food and nutrition security as a part of our foreign and development policy. And as a founding member of IFAD, we have an extremely productive partnership with the organisation. We doubled our funding to IFAD under the last replenishment, and we're strongly committed to maintaining our support. We're preparing now to take over the presidency of the EU. The priorities will be published this afternoon and launched. We are expecting, when those priorities are launched, to see that emphasis on the importance of the future of development cooperation and to acknowledge the importance of food within that overall discussion, the importance of food security in the current context. The recent councils that have been held at the highest level on foreign affairs have all discussed food security. We expect that to be a topic for leaders to discuss in the coming months, and we see that as something that is going to be important for us over the coming period. Ireland will continue to be a strong voice in calling for greater investment in smallholder farmers and in agricultural transformation to achieve sustainable food systems. And we will also continue to ensure that strong focus on what is happening now and the impacts that will have. So I'd like to thank the IIEA for hosting this important discussion. We really appreciate the partnership that we have with the IIEA, and we can see how it brings that important public debate to the fore in Ireland. So I'd like to thank everyone here for today and look forward to hearing from President Lario and what he has to say. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ruth. And now to our guest of honor and a little bit of a background. Alvaro Lario is president of the United Nations International Fund for Agricultural Development, and he is a seasoned international development finance leader who has more than 20 years of experience across academia, private sector and asset management, the World Bank Group and the United Nations, including as Associate Vice President of Financial Operations at IFAD. Under his stewardship, IFAD became the first United Nations fund to enter the capital markets and obtain a credit rating. This has enabled IFAD to expand resource mobilization efforts to the private sector. Before joining the fund in early 2018, he was the Treasury Capital Markets Lead and Principal Portfolio Officer at the International Finance Corporation, which, as you will know, is part of the World Bank Group, where he focused on local capital markets development and emerging markets investments. President Lario received a PhD in financial economics from the Complutense University of Madrid after completing a Master's of Research in Economics at the London Business School and a Master of Finance from Princeton University. You're very welcome to the IEA, President Lario. We are delighted that you could join us during your visit. And I would now like to invite you to the lectern to deliver your address, which is entitled From the Middle East Crisis to the Next Food Shock, Fertiliser, Energy and Global Food Security. Following the presentation, we will have Q&A, as I've mentioned previously. So just in relation to that, for those of you who are in the room here, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we will get a microphone to you. For those of you who are joining us online, you'll be able to join the discussion using the Q&A function in Zoom, which you should see on your screen now. I'd also appreciate if you would state your name and affiliation when you're asking your question. So without further ado, I would like to invite President Lario to take the lectern. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the IIEA for inviting us and to Irish Aid for having this very important discussion. I remember 3 years ago, actually, we had a similar discussion. Then we were discussing about some of the shocks that happened after Ukraine, what was then going on about the food supply, some of the responses, and here we are, probably 3 years later, whereby it's not any longer only about, I would say, what's happening related to oil shocks or food price shocks, but actually also about the future of development cooperation. As Ireland is now, as you were mentioning, taking the leadership in the EU and the presidency, and how that might relate to some of the discussions that you've had a couple of weeks ago with Commissioner Sikel. I think it's a fascinating and very interesting time actually on seeing what's the future of development cooperation, how can we also make sure that global food systems remain resilient, and what are the investments that are actually working. So I'm very much looking also forward to the exchange and some of the, I would say, ideas and on how we can all collectively make this happen. As you mentioned, it's always a pleasure to come to Ireland. There's lots of interest related to food security, to nutrition. Ireland is a big leader at the, I would say, international community on these topics. And it's always a very engaging and constructive discussion, I think, because of obviously also the historical background of Ireland, but the importance that you provide to agriculture and to food security. Our partnership between IFAD and Ireland is very much founded on a number of shared beliefs and very much values around the importance of small-scale farming, but also sustainable practices, and also as I was mentioning, the reality of when food systems fail, what are some of the consequences related to the social components of agriculture. What we're currently seeing right now probably is beyond the fertilizer shock or an oil shock. It's once more, and we are here every 3, 5, 10 years, as I was mentioning 3 years ago, that we see that every shock once more is presenting, and we're seeing recurrent shocks happening, where it's an oil shock, food price shock, input shock, inflation shock, constantly happening. So probably it's not anymore about shocks, but it's just the current, I would say, new normal. And this is also very important in how we might design the investments. For us, The investments need to provide resilience because we know that the next shocks is going to happen. So actually, I think it's about how we not only respond in the very short term, but how we build that resilience over the medium term. Most of the interest, especially when we bring together, as I always mention, ministers of finance, minister of agriculture, happens after the shock. We try to provide an immediate response, but this goes beyond that immediate response. I think it's how we can structurally address some of the challenges that the food systems have. And these relate to production, to productivity, yields, which is part of what we're discussing now, but also the entire infrastructure, which means distribution, which means transportation, which means storage, and all of that is more and more important. If we talk, for example, about Africa, it's very clear that a lot of the focus has been on productivity and yields, but when I'm talking to many of the leaders and the challenges they're going through right now, beyond the fertilizer, the main issue that they are asking is about, for example, storage. Storage is something pretty simple to understand. When you have that ability or that optionality or flexibility, it gives you more power at the time of selling and also the ability of when and how and what price to sell. And this is, for example, one of the elements. The reality of what we are seeing right now in the very short term is that it's true that we are in the planting season, so it's going to have a significant impact on the fertilizer side vis-a-vis productivity, yields, and also right now we're going through the availability because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but also the pricing. The pricing, one of the biggest issues is in the very short term, it's not that flexible. We have seen urea prices, which, as you know, is one of the components of nitrogen fertilizer, go up significantly. Now it's coming down, but the uncertainty continues. And for sure, we're going to see further stockpiling, build-up of reserves. So that's going to have certainly an impact also over the medium term. So it's almost certain that we will be seeing higher costs of food and food inflation over the next 9-12 months. The difference when I came 3 years ago, it was that it was an immediate shock to the supply, in this case of cereals and wheat. This will be a little bit more prolonged and it will be happening over time. So there's this also, I would say, difficulty on seeing that visibility. There's when I talk to a lot of the ministers, politicians, they focus on an immediate response on that. What are we going to do about the fertilizer prices? But as I said, this is just one element of a shock that is happening. We will be also seeing, and this is also not only on the planting, but also on the harvesting. There's a lot of mechanization that is also suffering or struggling. A lot of small-scale farmers, the ones who actually can afford the mechanization, on the fuel prices. Also on solar, for example, and when it's solar fuel and you need it for solar-powered irrigation, the one is an alternative to obviously fuel-powered. So this is also how you build resilience over time. So there's a number, I would say, of channels that we are seeing the current effect. Transportation costs, obviously the fuel directly on mechanization, but also fertilizer. Fertilizer is one of them. I'll perhaps want to show a short video of what we're seeing actually and some of these linkages that we're having in IFAD. It's, that we put together to try to also share how all of this is connected.
The conflict in the Middle East is reshaping commodity markets, driving up fuel, food, and fertilizer prices, affecting small-scale producers far beyond the region. The impact is systemic. Disruptions are moving through markets and supply chains and are being transmitted back to the first mile of food systems. Rising costs are constraining production, putting food security and economic stability at risk. Higher fuel prices raise transport and production costs, compress margins, and reduce small-scale producers' ability to access markets and generate income. Fertilizers underpin around 50% of global food production, yet within days of the conflict, fertilizer traffic collapsed by over 90%, stalling an estimated 3 to 4 million tons of monthly trade. These disruptions, combined with fuel price spikes, LNG up 66% and oil up 40% globally, are hitting small-scale producers just as nearly half of the world enters critical planting seasons. Small-scale farmers produce around 1/3 of the world's food and up to 70% in Africa. At the first mile, the rising costs disproportionately hit producers who have limited access to finance and markets. This is where IFAD operates. Working with governments and the private sector, IFAD invests at the first mile to de-risk and make rural economies more productive and investable. This includes expanding access to inputs such as seeds and fertilizers, strengthening rural finance systems to crowd in private capital, and investing in storage, aggregation, and logistics to build stronger value chains. These are not short-term responses, but long-term investments in stability, reducing fragility, generating jobs and income, and strengthening the food systems the world relies on. As a global investment platform for rural development, IFAD mobilizes public and private capital to scale resilient food systems and inclusive growth. In an increasingly volatile global context, the role played by IFAD 14 will be central to delivering impact at the first mile.
The message for us is that it's important that we act in the short term, where it's subsidy schemes, where we're talking about emergency assistance, but that's clearly not enough. And this is an opportunity to really point out the importance that the response needs to come also in these structural investments. Unfortunately, we need these shocks and these crises to once more remind ourselves of the importance of addressing the structural or the root causes of many of these elements. So fertilizer access does matter, fertilizer prices does matter, but still it's even more important to reduce the future dependency. As an example, when we talk about fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer, it's also important to combine it or to complement it with inorganic fertilizer, with also soil health, and soil really very much matters, with some practices that can also improve the efficiency. So all of this, I would say, is what we know that works in practice, which is an integrated approach. Just a subsidy, just a specific action is not going to solve it. And this is the complexity or the challenge of food systems, that many times we look for a silver bullet, but these are very, very complex systems that we know that need to be addressed for a lot of elements. So when we think about food systems or just as an agriculture component, it's not the reality. It's about energy, it's about infrastructure, it's about finance. So there's many elements if we want to have this resilience of food systems. And this is, I think, something that we have been working on and that is very important. And this brings me perhaps to connecting to what Commissioner Sikela or the EU Irish presidency, or what we believe needs to be also brought forward. And it's precisely this element, and Commissioner Sikela, I'm sure he talked about Global Gateway, about investment corridors. I was in Brussels talking also with the Director General of INPA. I met Commissioner Sikela a month and a half ago also in the World Bank meetings. And I think it's important, especially, and that we think about the response. And now we're discussing at Europe, and it will be partially a big discussion under the Irish EU presidency about the MFF, about the funding of Europe and of the Common Agricultural Policy over the next 6-8 years. It's very important also, many of these investments, where they're about Europe, or especially the ones I'm going to discuss abroad, is that they do not only focus on the bigger infrastructure. I think it's important that they all take elements of how we connect it to the rural areas, how this makes a transformation also in the lives of people. So when we're talking about investment corridors, it cannot only be about exports, it cannot be only about trade, which is very important, and this is also what we do, but it needs to be how are we actually making a difference. And let me give you an example. Sometimes in certain countries, we see big multilateral development banks actually investing in big dams, water storage, water management, very important. But then what we see is that a lot of those connections to the rural areas or to the small-scale farmers do not happen. The pipes, the smaller dams do not exist. And this is, I think, where it needs to be complemented. And this is where our investments into those rural areas happen. If you really want to address poverty, obviously economic growth is very important. But another important element is how that translates really into the people. That's also the social cohesion, the social fabric, and creating those jobs. If we think about extreme poverty is still 80% of it is in rural areas. And many of the opportunities in these least developed countries relate to food systems, to agriculture, to creating jobs in those value chains. And I think that's why it's very important that when we're talking about the Global Gateway Initiative is that we extend many of these infrastructure investments also into rural economies, into people. And I think there has been a critique about the Global Gateway related to that. They're also trying to see how it can be complemented. And I think that will become even more important going forward. Otherwise, if we only talk about, let's say, agriculture is a good example. We see a lot of investments actually from big financial institutions or development financial institutions on trade finance. And trade agriculture finance is very important. but that does not always translate, obviously, into small-scale farmers onto rural areas. So we need to make sure that there's a balance on how those investments are coming, and that a lot of the policy investments and return on investments, whether it's because of the geopolitics or the economic returns, are also complemented with the social returns. Otherwise, it's very easy that we will be losing a lot of parts of population that actually are not being do not reap those benefits. And this is part of what, when we discuss about inequality, how the world is going, how a lot of the politics in many countries go, they relate very much, in my view, about inequality. And this is a big element of how a lot of the social fabric has been also lost. So for us, I think we were discussing also with President Connolly, but also with other ministers about the importance of the EU presidency. I think it's important that food security, and this is one of the things that we were discussing, comes also as a big component of that presidency, and especially at this moment in time. I think it's a time where, yeah, we're seeing that, unfortunately, I launched the global food report on crises a couple of weeks ago in London, and right now we have still 2 famines in Gaza and in Sudan. There's another one which could be coming in South Sudan. It's very clear that some of the consequences, as some of our sister agencies were saying in Rome, could make another 45 million fall into extreme poverty and extreme food insecurity. So the figures are still alarming. They have come down after a lot of, I would say, decades of progress. The last 2-3 years or 3-4 years have not been very positive. And now the trend is stale, and if anything, because of the shocks, could get worse. So I think it's important that that food security still remains a big component of, I would say, international development policy. And we can, if there's also questions or willingness to address also international development cooperation and how it's going. I think one of my main points, I think IFAD, is that we're well suited as a development financial institution to talk about jobs, income, trying to facilitate investments, trade. That's part of our nature. But once more, the most important element of where we come is that targeting of rural communities, of the first mile, of still addressing poverty and hunger. And that cannot be lost. We talk more and more in development about investment, about trade, jobs. It's very important, but at the same time, I don't hear as much anymore talking about poverty or hunger. So those are elements that to me are crucial, related to inequality, and that we still should be putting on the table. Perhaps to start concluding, I think our partnership with Ireland is very strong, whether it's about co-investment, whether it's about nutrition, where it's still about how we can make sure that food security remains at the center, and also this integrated approach, which is the way that we know, building many times cooperatives, building that social fabric, and I think that remains still a very important element. For us, we're very much looking forward to continue with this strong partnership, looking forward to also support during the EU presidency, and especially to bring, I would say, or use the current uncertainty to still focus on the things that we believe should be relevant and we should be putting on the table, which relate once more to inequality, to poverty, and to hunger. And many times, I think, still agriculture and food systems is one of the ways of creating those economic opportunities that are not there. So thank you very much for having me today. And
thank you very much indeed, President Lario. Quite a lot to take in, and for us to discuss in the coming half hour that we have for it as well. But I suppose looking at it from my side, and having worked in developing countries, and obviously also worked with IFAD 20 years ago, I was involved in strategic partnerships with IFAD, and IFAD as an organization has come a long way, in my opinion, in 20 years, and certainly has changed and is doing excellent work on the ground. But one area that I'd like to sort of ask you about, and you mentioned it there, you have multilateral development banks putting in the big money, they're putting it in for the big infrastructure, but sometimes it's not going down to the grassroots people, the small farmer, smallholder farmer, who's trying to just even feed his family and make some money by taking his crops to market as well. So, and then you have other minority groups that are in that as well, such as women and youth and disabled people. One of my abiding memories in Malawi is that it is the women that are out who are doing the smallholding farming. They're out there trying to eke a living, to get food security for their family and to make a little bit at the markets. And of course, then the system isn't there for them. The markets aren't set up in a way that would help them. Everybody brings tomatoes the same day, you know, so tomato price falls. So again, the systems aren't really for them, but there for them. But how do you feel that these groups could be really meaningfully, I suppose, integrated into agricultural transformation? And given the fact that we have rising unemployment, we have climate change, at every turn, some of these smallholder farmers, they're just met with one catastrophe after another. They're selling their little bits and pieces to try and feed their family when there's a crisis. So how do you feel that IFAD could help these particular, if you like, group of people to have a better income, to be able to farm a little bit better? And what kind of assistance can you see that you can give them?
Thank you very much. So I think probably we've been through here whether small-scale farmer is beautiful or not, or we have an idea. I think the most important part probably is that, as you mentioned, many times it's not a simple, I would say, answer, but it's this market access, this ability of really being able to have certain control or ability of shaping price, not being just a price taker as such, as you were mentioning, a structure where it relates to a cooperative, where it relates to how are they being financed, where they get insurance. We were discussing yesterday also at a different event, also insurance as such. I think there's a lot of components that need to be made in place in order for small-scale farming not to be about subsistence farming, but about small-scale production. Sometimes it's about micro, small SMEs. And for that, it's very clear that ODA is just a very tiny bucket. I mean, agriculture as such, overall ODA is 5%, which could be around, if ODA is around 200 billion, which now is less, it's around 10 billion, 9 billion. That's very small. Most of their flows in a country relate very much to local, actually, private sector flows, where we're talking about small SMEs, we're talking about then perhaps how that connects to the local financial institutions. So it's very clear for IFAD, we need to work with the local private sector, we need to work with the local financial institutions, and we need to work with the governments to create that ecosystem that actually is enabling that development of local private sector. And local private sector can be from very small cooperatives, social enterprises, to micro enterprises, to medium enterprises, and where they are in the value chain. If not, we're more talking about just subsistence farming, which many times is not really, I would say, as you said, viable, or it's not sustainable over time. And that's a very difficult conversation to have. And also for institutions or multilateral institutions or development institutions, because the reality is that takes us to difficult decisions of what's the nature and the goal of these institutions. To me, is to catalyze, to enable, and to mobilize, and to help and support governments to create those conditions. The financing per se, we're talking about, in order to transform food systems in Africa, our estimate is 70 to 80 billion per year. That's per year. That's a very big amount. So we clearly need to work with the local financial institutions, with the local private sector and the government to create the enabling conditions and the investments. For us, that has meant a transformation whereby we're actually right now using our own financing to also finance some of these local financial institutions, to finance some of the local private sector, and to also invest in certain impact funds. So we have to clearly find as many channels and enablers to bring this additional financing to that first mile. We can design, we can supervise, we can support governments, but we need not to think only on what we finance directly, but how to catalyze a huge ecosystem and environment that needs to be trying to address these specific issues at the first mile. And this is the challenge. At the global trade finance, there's enough money. At the big agribusinesses, even in Africa, there's lots of investments, but at this, we have to see who are the partners. For us, it means public development banks in the countries, agriculture development banks, local financial institutions, farmers' organizations, certain size cooperatives. Those can really scale up. This is a matter of scaling also, because we are talking about hundreds of millions of small-scale farmers.
No, thanks very much. It is, as you say, a complex issue as well. And I suppose when you were talking, one thing that strikes me, and also listening to you this morning on Morning Ireland as well, is that you're bringing to us, if you like, the bad news of what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz, which means that it's going to have this impact on Asia and Africa and on food security in general. Is there an opportunity here this might sound a bit, to actually say, now is the time to change. Now is the time to do things differently. Now is the time to change the systems. Is there an opportunity here for IFAD and indeed other UN organizations to actually address these, you know, the word I'm looking for here is systems which are ineffective or that need to be changed? Like, has this crisis, or is this crisis also an opportunity to do things differently? Do you think that there is the willpower there as well from the international governments to do this? Because it's going to impact on everybody, the developed countries and developing countries. Food security will impact on us all as a result of what's happening now. But is there also in there that little chink of an opportunity to actually address globally what is wrong with the system and how we might be able to change things? And things won't change overnight, but at least start that process.
I think the good news, probably to also share some, I think since the Ukraine invasion by Russia, I have seen a good number of leaders, especially in Africa, which is where we need a lot of the transformation, committing or willing to discuss or to focus or to intentionally invest in food sovereignty, food self-sufficiency. Some of them have actually become self-sufficient in certain crops or in certain value chains. I was recently in Nairobi. I met probably 8, 10 African presidents, and it was incredible that many of them actually went to the detail about storage, distribution. We need this here, we need that there. So now I would say I have seen, compared to perhaps 3, 4 years ago when I came here, more of a political commitment of many of these leaders actually to prioritize this type of food self-sufficiency just because they see the type of impact to all of the shocks. So I think that starts always with this political ownership, with this political intentional willingness to address these matters, especially in the countries that are more food import or inputs dependent on their imports of many of these matters. And that's where it starts. So in that sense, I think it's not only an opportunity, but I do believe that it's starting to be prioritized. And many more people are seeing this food security as part of their day-to-day or strategic national security, many of these leaders. In Europe, we have done that for many years. In the US too, Japan or China too. But in many other countries, especially in the developing economies, it had not been at the forefront. India is doing that right now, but Africa did not. And I think since I came here 3 years ago, I've seen more and more leaders actually focusing on that, not only talking, but actually seeing where they want to become self-sufficient, what should be the investments in the medium term, rather than only the short-term response. So I think in that sense, it's a message of optimism. I hope that will also translate into disinvestment plans from the government and the international community supporting that type of investment. I think it's a joint work.
Okay, thank you very much. I might go to the floor and see who is gentleman here in front. If you could give us your name, please.
Yeah, Ronan Tynan, filmmaker and member of the Institute. First of all, thank you for a very illuminating presentation, because once again, you show how complex the global food system is, but also how vulnerable it is. And one thing that really perturbs me, you actually mentioned, in fact, I'm sure some would have been startled that you used the word famine in relation to Gaza, again, Gaza and Sudan. I was more aware of Sudan than Gaza, because that word's not been really used too much about Gaza lately, though I am aware the Israelis are once again turning the screw on the Palestinians there. But just a general question in relation to that. Surely the time has come when we need an international legal instrument to make the creation of famines specifically illegal under international law. I mean, all famines nowadays are a result of government policies, either in a conflict situation. I'm very familiar with Syria. I saw the way Assad did it in Syria, using famine, starvation as a weapon of war. The Israelis doing the same thing in Gaza. And Sudan can be analysed the same way. And it would be a very useful way of highlighting the legal responsibility of governments to take food security seriously, and then to criminalize the creation of famine, because international legal instruments don't just secure accountability, they also raise the profile of the rights of people to food. Secondly, very brief question. I did not unfortunately hear your interview on Morning Ireland, and you may have covered this point, but it has been bothering me for some time that there is no pressure for a specific channel to allow ships carrying fertilizers to make safe passage through the Straits of Hormuz. A similar measure was actually implemented in a much more complex conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which is ongoing in the Black Sea. So if they could do it over the Black Sea, surely in the Strait of Hormuz, given no matter how we carve it up, millions of lives potentially are at risk if this drags on. And all the indications are it is going to drag on despite the rhetoric at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ronan.
Well, thank you. I think one of the, probably, as you mentioned, of the, I would say, main messages of the global report on food crisis that we put forward is that hunger drives conflict and conflict drives hunger. This is one of the key elements there. And what you mentioned, that's also very interesting. Actually, we were part with FAO of the Black Sea Grain Initiative that put together that during the Ukraine invasion of war. Right now, we are leading also with FAO on the current food security and logistics response or coordination in the UN. That has not been put forward, but certainly that's something that I could envision could be a good response. Unfortunately, because of everything that, and we have had news this night, and it seems that there's so much uncertainty that we all were expecting it to be reopened very soon. So perhaps if this prolongs, that could be one way as an international response of trying to carve that initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. I might take one from the online. Mairead Redmond has a question in here, and she has asked, she says, recently 1.8 million Indian farmers won the world's largest environmental prize for going completely chemical free, successfully transitioning to what is referred to as natural farming. Can food security and resilience strategies like this one be implemented in Ireland too?
Wow.
So it's bringing it back to the national, all things are local.
Well, that would be difficult for me to answer about Ireland. I can tell you that both at the Parliament as well as I would say with ministers, sustainability and what it implies, and I would say some of the economic consequences is there. For IFAD, I would talk about the entire world, and we obviously, I think it needs to be, to me, it's not feasible, and not about Ireland specifically, but in the world to believe that we're going to go into inorganic fertilizers or that it's something from an economic point of view that we will be doing overnight or that it's going to happen. However, I think it's important, as we did with the renewable energy as an international community, that it needs to complement, and over time that the economics should be there. For us, I mentioned some of the important elements related to soil health, related to efficiency, related to certain practices. We also promote agroecological practices, but we have to be also sincere. Right now, for many of the small-scale farmers in these least developed countries, there's 3-4 years where actually it might imply lower yields until they make the transition. Somebody needs to finance that. Farming is a business. So I think this is part of the conversations that we're having, trying to find ways of monetizing some of them with them in some of these least developed countries. So it's a very complex issue, but I do believe, or my message would be that we need obviously to find ways of complementing nitrogen fertilizer for sure.
Thank you. No. Jill, I know you had your hand up earlier, so if you'd like to ask a question. Thank you, Mairead, for that question.
Thank you very much indeed for a very interesting speech, President Lario. You mentioned their stockpiling, and I was reading last week that the EU was almost suggesting stockpiling and joint procurement as a strategy for dealing with it. It struck me as very much an EU-oriented approach as opposed to a global approach. And I just wondered, is that counterintuitive from the development point of view?
Thank you. I think the challenge right now is that sometimes we do rush to take quick measures in terms of, it's very clear that because of the uncertainty, or at least human behavior will mean that over the next 9-12 months, we will be increasing our results, both where we're talking about fuel, or where we're talking about fertilizers, or so that's going to create, I would say, a minimum or a floor in terms of prices, because a lot of countries are going to rush into it. And I always quote what happened during also, I think it was 2008, 2009, 2010, where we rushed because there was not enough food production, and it was a shock to subsidize a lot of the seeds. So we subsidized seeds, production came up. The next year, a lot of it was rotten because we didn't have the storage or the distribution. So sometimes we have to be careful on that type of measures. But clearly, I would say the behavior, and because of the uncertainty, it's going to mean that when you have more uncertainty, you need more buffer. So there's going to be that rush to do so. But it's like also for many countries, and what we saw in the past about export restrictions. I mean, more than the stockpiling, I think the biggest threat or the biggest risk I see as an international leader is that Certain countries at some moment in time might start restricting whether it's inputs or exports of certain inputs or even food. I mean, it happened because of certain climate shocks related to rice. And that, if anything, is going to be worse off for everyone. So I think that I see it more as a risk, but clearly stockpiling coordination and how countries or geographical areas go over it could be also a risk.
Thanks very much indeed. Aidan, I think you had your hand up as well, and then I'll come to this gentleman here.
Yeah, Aidan O'Driscoll. I had the opportunity of talking to Alvaro yesterday when he spoke to the Irish Forum for International Agricultural Development. Two things I just want to say. First, you started by talking about food systems and you finished by talking about focusing on poverty and hunger. And I think that's a great message. And in fact, it worries me a little with all of our talk about food systems, which I fully agree with. And of course, it's the right frame. We sometimes lose the message about what it is we're trying to do, and the focus on poverty and hunger is at the end of the day what it's all about. I find, in fact, a lot of people outside the kind of circle who discuss these things are quite confused when we talk about food systems. So I think we need to be careful on that. So congratulations on that. My question to you is your mention of food sovereignty and the movement towards that in African countries in particular. Back in the 90s, when we had after various problems, a lot of countries built up strategic food reserves, strategic grain reserves, right? And the experience was mixed. I've experience of operating one myself, but in my view was largely positive, although mixed. But it is absolutely clear that this kind of thing would be much better done on a regional basis. Right? And that requires your investment in intra-African trade, and your support for building perhaps regional reserves of fertilizer. It would be very good if we had such a reserve now, wouldn't it? And indeed of grain reserves or other such key products. My question to you really is, do you see that as feasible? From your experience, does the politics align with that? Can you get that kind of regional action?
I think that's a very important point, and I also try to bring it up with especially many African leaders. We had the announcement about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So I've been trying with the previous commissioner, the current one, some of the African Union, some of the presidents of these nations. The reality is that we are very, very far away because of infrastructure, because of standards, because of even issues related to currency. So unfortunately, the current perspective is, I would say we are coming from a very, 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 very low base. So that's the potential is massive. And it will create, when I was mentioning storage or distribution, I mean, it just gives you much more flexibility, power on pricing and on diversification. What doesn't make sense, I think, and this should come from the African leaders and the neighboring countries that you have, is that, for example, you are having excess production in certain matters, and you're not even able to sell it to your neighboring country. That's a big issue. I think beyond reserves, I think the investments, and it's difficult. You have to agree, even if it will start with bilaterals, trilaterals, regional approaches in Africa specifically. But there's very few success stories around it, and this is an issue, and this is a big problem. I see a little bit of talk, a little bit of focus. Still, we are also in a different political, I would say, maturity, which relates more to many of these leaders, which I think still is positive, are finding out what do they want to be sovereign on, because you cannot be sovereign on everything. What should be your competitive advantage? Where do you have to invest? What are the key ways of your investment stretching it to the maximum you can? And these discussions are happening. Some of the leaders are going through them and investing. But from there to the region, I think it's probably the next phase, but it's extremely important for, I would say, even economic added value, for jobs, for really having that power. Another of the, I think, encouraging signs is that some of them, even on food, beyond critical minerals, are also thinking about how to transform it and adding value in the country. And that's how I think it's also important. Whether you talk about the agro-processing zones, industrialization of the, you could look at it from many angles, but at least that's also encouraging. But so I mean, probably the next steps, as you were mentioning, is that regional trade, but it's still not close.
Thank you. This gentleman here in the second row.
Hello, my name is Alan Moore. I work with an international NGO called the Irish Legal Credit Union Foundation. We actually work with IFAD for the last 10 years, and we're working jointly with Irish Aid now on a project in East Africa. And I suppose it's mainly a comment, your reference to the current crisis, but the importance of investing in the overall infrastructure, and in our case, the rural financial sector. So we have seen that does work. It does take time. It is challenging, and you're very correct, and we need to plan for the next crisis. We've seen it firsthand in other parts of Africa. So it's just to say, to keep working on that long-term agenda as well. We're all looking at the short term as well, but it's very important, and we can see in Africa. I suppose one comment from our side or question would be, we've seen increased engagement by African countries to look at the first mile, but have you any experience or advice to share with us when we're trying to make those connections? And as you said, it's a very complex ecosystem and competing priorities as to how to, I suppose, I won't say fast track it, but further encourage governments to look. And it happens in Ireland, not just at the short term, but also at the long term and at, as you said, the first mile.
I think perhaps my only comment there, and that I try also with governments and with all of our partners, is that I think we need to make lives of many of these governments, which many times don't have the capacity, as easy as possible. So we all come from many different fronts. So I think platforms, initiatives that bring people together or that avoid fragmentation are very important, and how we can actually partner together. To me, it's not just the rhetoric on partnership. I think it's just, it makes so much easier for many of these governments to have the absorption capacity, because many times they don't, if we just facilitate that. And that's part of what I'm trying also to bring to IFAD, that mentality or mindset. It's not only about IFAD, it's not about that financing, it's about how we bring others together there. And that's the most relevant, not IFAD, how we make the lives easier for governments to support this type of population.
Thank you. I'm going to take one from online here now. It's Paul Troy, who works with Irish Aid. How can IFAD champion nutrition globally beyond its own organisation to address its often forgotten status? Sting in the tail on that one.
Yeah, I think nutrition is, if we have challenge talking about poverty, hunger, or even inequality, nutrition is not that it's less relevant, but it's even more difficult many times to bring it to the forefront. I think nutrition is also one of these things that beyond, I would say, very clear programs like, for example, school meals, which we participate, or homegrown school meals, and how to connect it to local small-scale farmers. That's a very clear one. You see children, you see nutrition, education, it's very easy to link. But among the communities, it requires a lot of capacity building, a lot of discussions, just like I would say even with women's empowerment. And that makes it very difficult. Many governments do not want to invest on that. They have to many times choose between, do you put the emphasis there, do you put it on investments or bigger infrastructure investments? So for many of these governments, it's very, very complex or difficult, especially in the least developed countries. School meals is one of these areas where actually a lot of things come together, and we're also trying there to bring that nutrition component, where it's to the school, to the families. So yeah, I acknowledge it's not a simple topic. Yeah.
Thank you. The lady over here had her hand up first, and I know there's somebody here as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I found that fascinating. I've been fortunate enough to have worked in Africa and India in the past, but one of the interesting things for me was, sorry, I should have named myself, Mary Rose Greville, Trinity Business School, and a member of the IIEA as well. But the really interesting thing for me is what you said about talking with local communities, smaller and smaller local communities, because I was very fortunate that I actually did cultural anthropology in a very long past, but the realization of the significance of ethnic groupings in the ways in which they work together and share together, and the way in which the presumption of democracy is that the authority comes from the top. But then what about the other groupings who feel deprived by all of this process? I think you've recognized that particularly well, but I do think that there's a huge issue in Europe about not understanding what colonialism did to Africa and what we need to see as the resilient or the residual elements of all of that as well. We've also worked, sorry, I'm being too long. Okay, leave it there.
I think
Sorry, I might just take the last question because we are running out of time here, and this lady's had her hand up a few times. So maybe we take the two questions together because we're coming up.
My name's Niño Herriot. I work for Trocra. I was very interested to hear you start to talk about ODA and the reduction in odour. From your point of view, what funding mechanisms do you see coming forward in the future where the ODA is shrinking to help last mile communities?
Okay, thank you. So we'll leave it with that if that's okay. And
Yeah, so I
President
think
Lario.
three messages there probably. For us at IFAD, and this is where the balance of what we are well known or the reputation is actually because we go into that first mile, we discuss with the communities, the farmers organization, the women's association, and that's costly, requires time and energy. And many times development, we want things quickly, we want returns, and that's something that we're well known for, and I hope we do not lose in our current investments. When you talk about, and this perhaps, and I think I can say it publicly, I will not name the president of Africa with whom I was having this discussion, but he was very clear. All of our infrastructure that we have relates to how do we connect our mines to the ports, our things to just get all of the critical minerals or whatever it was over the commodities over the last century out of the country. So I think that's why our future investments cannot focus just on how do we get all of that out of Africa, but actually how do we connect Africa? And I think that needs to be part of the important element behind many of the investments that we're getting forward. So that's very important. In terms of what you mentioned, I think it would take me probably another 3 events to discuss the future of development cooperation. I think that balance probably between I would say the social return, not only the investment return, but also recognizing and acknowledging, as I think we have been doing in IFAD and transforming, that we need instruments, we need vehicles to really try to multiply, mobilize, and be as effective as we can. Right now, as an example, I mentioned that we are co-investing with the private sector. We're also developing guarantees as a way to try to expand, mobilize further. So institutions need to evolve, and we need to find new ways, given the environment, to also how to bring or how, but also that it can be effective for the local private sector, for other international private sector, for financial institutions to multiply that impact. And that sometimes gets to difficult discussions and to a need of culture change within institutions that we need to evolve to match the current present. And I think that's also a discussion that many governments, many ministries, wherever I go, are putting out white papers, thinking the different ways of how to address it, how to be fit for the purpose for the current moment. And that's it's a fascinating discussion for sure.
Thank you very much indeed. Indeed, we have many more questions coming in online, and I'm sure here as well, but unfortunately time is running out for us, President Lario. So I would just like to thank all of you who've attended here today and those who've participated online for engaging in today's discussion. And I'm sure you'll all agree this has been a really interesting topic and one which we're going to hear a lot more about, and for all the wrong reasons, I think, in the coming months as well. But and I would in particular like to thank the Irish Aid team and indeed for their continued funding of the Development Matters series, which allows these type of events to be held. Also for me personally, to the team at the IIEA, to Jill Donahue, Avian Dolan and the research and the sound team here, and all those in the background who make these events happen. And last but indeed not least, I would like to thank you, President Lario, for your commitment and dedication to this important topic, for the work that you're doing with IFAD, how you've brought it along since you've joined IFAD. I think the amazing strides that have been made, and I'm sure it's in safe hands with you for the new strategy, which I would have liked to ask about, which hopefully will be coming online next year, but don't have time to do that at the moment. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know how tight these schedules are when you come to town. To actually be with us here today, and continued success with your work, and indeed a safe journey back to Rome this evening as well. And on behalf of everybody here, a very big thank you and a bit of a